Welcome everybody to the 2021 SPP Workshop presentations. I'm going to start sharing screen with the first presentation of today. Here we go. Let me make it. Are you able to visualize the presentation? Oops, sorry, I actually clicked on the wrong button because the other one was hidden. Here we go. Are you able to visualize the presentation? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to leave the floor to our first group, who is going to present their study on the impacts of COVID-19 on Massachusetts municipalities and their recovery strategies. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Our team will be presenting our work on the impacts of COVID-19 on Massachusetts municipalities and their recovery strategies. My name is George Plouffe. My team members are Gishin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gishin.
Elizabeth Murphy.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Murphy.
Madeline Leue.
Hello, I'm Madeline Leue.
And Htut.
Hi, I'm Htut.
The principal investigator and our faculty advisor was Marta Vicarelli. She's running this today. Our work is in partnership with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, the MMA. They're a nonprofit that seeks to enhance the effectiveness of cities and towns within our Commonwealth, with the goal of increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of municipal service delivery. The questions that we posed in our survey were aimed at gathering information on the challenges that municipalities are facing because of the COVID-19 public health crisis and the associated socioeconomic fallout, strategies adopted to address these challenges, as well as the issues that are currently being prioritized by municipal leaders. We focus on 8 areas to include impacts on municipal operations, strategies that are adopted by municipalities in their emergency response and their current priorities, funding and financial impacts on municipal budgets, vaccine preparedness, planning and best practices, equity indicators used in monitoring the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, impacts on vulnerable populations, especially regarding food and housing security, impacts on local businesses, as well as possible strategies for an inclusive and sustainable post-COVID socioeconomic recovery.
As George mentioned, we worked with the MMA, the Mass Municipal Association, and they were interested in figuring out how COVID has affected Massachusetts cities and towns. So they recruited our research team. After some preliminary meetings with the MMA about topics and questions, we designed our survey on Qualtrics. We then met with 4 mayors or town managers, depending on where they were from, in order to make sure that we had addressed the right topics and didn't leave anything important out. This was the focus group stage. After the focus groups, we tweaked the survey and the final version was sent out by the MMA on February 22nd. 117 municipalities responded by the deadline of March 2nd. And then just a note, we worked in partnership with the MMA, but we collected the data and did the analysis on our own. So any data issues would be our fault alone and not related to the MMA. After we got our responses, we drafted an executive summary that has already been published and disseminated. In fact, it was published and disseminated in March. And we are planning to complete our final report this summer.
So this is the response density map of Massachusetts for our survey. So the color gradient goes from lighter to darker, with the color getting darker as percentage of responses increases. And the percentage for each county is calculated by the ratio of municipalities in each county that answered our survey and the total number of municipalities in that county. So for example, Nantucket has 100% response rate since there is only one municipality and since we got the response from it. And the average response rate for each county, it's around 37.4%, with 100% being an outlier. Next. So this is the table of the demographics breakdown of the municipalities that took our survey compared to total municipalities in Massachusetts. So 1/3 of the municipalities in Massachusetts answered our survey. And in our respondents, 21% of the municipalities are cities, while 79% of it is towns. So the percentages of cities in our sample is slightly higher compared to Massachusetts as a whole. However, the characteristics in our sample are comparable to that of the entire state in terms of percentage of communities defined as rural level 1, rural level 2, the average municipal per capita income, and average municipal population size. Just to note, the rural level 1 and rural level 2 are rural definitions that Massachusetts State Office of Rural Health defined. So the towns in level 2 are less densely populated and more remote and isolated from urban core areas. And the towns in level 1 have less rural criteria than rural level 2. And as we know, not rural are the ones that are urban.
Next, we're going to look at some of the results, the key results from our survey. In this survey question, we asked municipalities to select how severe various COVID-19 impacts were in respect to municipal operations. It's a little hard to see, but our color scale ranges from severe impact in dark blue to no impact in light green. And this figure is ranked by the number of severe responses. Looking at this figure, over 70% of municipalities reported either moderate or severe impacts across the majority of municipality operations. Most specifically, over 90% of respondents reported moderate to severe impacts associated with COVID-19 in terms of restrictions to in-person access or the complete closure of town, city hall, or public buildings, as well as handling the transitioning of school to remote or hybrid learning. In our next question, we asked municipalities to identify what strategies they adopted in their general operations in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Our color scale was used in order to rank responses from most common to least common, progressing from dark blue to light green, respectively. In this figure, we can see the most commonly adopted organizational strategies across municipalities include transitioning to electronic public meetings, enhancing public health and safety protocols in order to facilitate access to municipal buildings, as well as adopting or expanding remote working for municipal employees. An interesting note is that some municipalities did recognize the mental toll that the pandemic took on many people. 40% of municipalities reported taking action to introduce programs in order to enhance employees' mental health and wellness during this time. For this next figure, we asked municipalities to rate the level of priority across a number of key areas that have arisen in relation to the pandemic. Our color scale ranges from severe impact in dark blue to no impact in light green, and this figure is ranked by the number of severe responses. The top 3 priority areas for municipalities in relation to COVID-19 are preparing for vaccine distribution, enhancing public health and safety protocols to facilitate continuity of in-person learning, and addressing municipal budget and finance challenges. In line with our earlier findings of the most severely impacted areas of municipal operations, over 80% of respondents ranked enhancing remote learning capabilities of hybrid models for schools as a moderate or high priority. In relation to strategies that municipalities did adopt to combat the effect of COVID-19, in this figure, we asked municipalities if they foresee any changes to the use of these strategies over the next year. Our color scale in this figure represents all the 4 common strategies that were adopted, and this figure groups those strategies by the respondents' answers. As you can see, a large majority of municipalities stated that over the next year, they will adopt a hybrid format between the pre- and post-pandemic practices in relation to electronic public meetings, virtual community engagement, and remote working for municipal employees, while 40% of respondents identified remote permitting processes being an option to continue in a fully online platform.
The next section of the survey was focused on vaccination planning for municipalities. So for this survey question, we asked municipalities to select how they gauge their ability to administer vaccines within the municipality. And here the chromatic scale is the various responses, with the darker colors indicating a higher confidence in their ability to provide the vaccines. About 70% of municipalities reported that they are definitely or likely able to administer vaccines, while about 20% responded being very or definitely unable to administer vaccines. And then for respondents who responded that they may or may not be able to, possible reasons could have been that there were vaccine supply chain issues, storage issues, or funding issues. This answer is pretty ubiquitous for what it could have meant. Good to go to the next slide? Okay. In their survey question, we asked municipalities to select what resources they had available for facilitating vaccinations. Like in the previous question, the chromatic scale here is the various responses, with the darker colors indicating a higher confidence in their ability. So from this figure, we saw that a large majority, specifically 81%, have a page on the municipal website providing regular updated information on vaccinations. The majority of municipalities also responded to having volunteers to assist with vaccination registration and scheduling by phone, as well as having developed outreach and education programs about COVID-19 and vaccination. However, a minority of municipalities responded having the resources to support vaccinations for elderly and vulnerable populations, including transportation to and from vaccination sites and the ability to provide vaccinations at home. And then a small minority respondents of municipalities responded that they had a page on their website offering vaccination registration and scheduling. For this survey question, we asked municipalities to select how strongly they agreed with statements around vaccine preparedness, resources, and supply. And here the darker colors represent a stronger agreement to the statements. So an interesting finding from this question was that although 75% of municipalities reported having enough financial resources to start vaccine clinics, 72%, so an almost equal amount, indicated that they did not have access to sufficient vaccine supply. Furthermore, in response to an open-ended survey question asking what the most helpful resource would be to support municipal vaccine distribution efforts, 63% of respondents identified a larger and more continuous vaccine supply as the most important resource. Another open response question associated with this survey also yielded some other interesting findings. So in one question that invited respondents to share additional thoughts, 20% of respondents identified the redirection of vaccines to mass statewide sites from these local clinical municipal sites as being the main impediment to municipal vaccination planning and implementation. Several respondents also reported concerns about equitable access to vaccines in rural versus urban areas of Massachusetts.
We next asked our municipalities questions in regard to the equity of impacts and interventions related to the COVID-19 crisis. We asked municipalities if they were using any of the following types of local data in monitoring the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic: health statistics like infection rates, hospitalizations and deaths, employment statistics, food security metrics, and homeless population statistics. They were able to indicate yes, no, or yes, and the data is disaggregated by race and ethnicity. 74% of municipalities reported that they were currently using local health statistics to monitor the impacts of COVID-19, while 33% reported monitoring food security, and under 25% reported monitoring employment and/or homeless population indicators. And what we found is that the availability of disaggregated data was rare. 7% of respondents indicated that health data they use offers information on race and ethnicity, while less than 3% of respondents reported access to disaggregated data for employment, food security, or homelessness. This lack of disaggregated data makes assessments about the equity of impacts of and interventions for COVID-19 on different populations difficult to make. We further asked them if local governments were using any racial equity tools or impact assessments in making decisions about the allocation of resources for COVID-19. And only 7% of municipalities stated that they currently use racial equity tools or impact assessments, while 31% reported that they currently lacked these tools, but they were interested in acquiring them. So we asked some specific questions regarding impacts of COVID-19 on food and housing security. We asked municipalities, how severely have residents in your municipality been affected by food insecurity, homelessness, and housing issues in relation to the COVID-19 crisis? 30% of municipalities reported either significant or severe impacts of COVID-19 on food insecurity, while 14% of municipalities reported significant or severe impacts of COVID-19 on housing insecurity. And then we asked them, has your municipality invested resources in programs to support housing and food security in relation to the COVID-19 crisis? And 74%, the vast majority of our respondents, had already invested resources in programs to support food security, while a more modest 38% had invested resources in programs to support housing security. Later in our survey, we also asked our municipalities if they have sufficient resources to either begin or continue to invest in housing and food security in the next 6 to 12 months, so until August or February of 2021. 40% of municipalities reported that they would be able to support food security on an ongoing basis, while only 22% said that they could support housing security going forward, indicating that there may be a need to support these interventions at the state and or federal level.
In this section, we wanted to learn more about the impacts of businesses reported by municipalities. So we asked municipalities what percentage of businesses had to limit operations. And in this figure, there are 4 color schemes, each representing each category of business. And it was 5 answer options was given. And the percentages beside each bar represents what percent of municipality report to that answer option. This is a figure with lots of information. So I'm going to summarize the key percentages and talk about the essential trends we observe from this figure. Over 70% of municipalities reported that at least half of the hospitality businesses and small businesses had to limit operations. So we get that information from the 2 bars that says 50 to 75% and 75 to 100%. In the same way, over 55% of municipalities reported that at least half of the retail businesses and service businesses had to limit operations. And in the next slide, we asked about the percentage of businesses that had to stop operations. And this figure layout is similar to the previous figure. And here, over 35% of municipalities reported that at least 10% of hospitality and small businesses had to permanently close. And over 25% of municipalities reported that at least 10% of the retail and service businesses had to permanently close. So from these 2 figures, we can see that hospitality and small businesses are the most affected by the COVID-19 crisis.
The last section of our survey was about green recovery. States and municipalities around the US have started exploring possible COVID-19 economic recovery pathways. The expression green recovery has emerged to describe policies that push for low carbon economic growth, prioritizing renewable energy, energy efficiency, green transport, and other environmentally beneficial projects. One of the priorities of green recovery is to unleash innovation and generate new, long-lasting jobs quickly to compensate for the job losses resulting from the pandemic and lockdowns. As you can see from this question, we asked what green recovery strategies that municipalities are interested in. And you can see that the darkest blue is strong interest, whereas the lightest blue is no interest. Some of our findings included that roughly 59% of Massachusetts municipalities disclosed that the concept of green recovery had not yet been discussed in their municipality. However, we know that this might change in the near future since green recovery is a part of President Joe Biden's infrastructure plan. Among green recovery strategies, municipalities are most interested in incentives to support energy efficiency, 67%, and incentives to invest in climate resilient infrastructure of transport, communication, water and energy networks, for example, enhancing flood protection schemes. And that was about 60% of municipalities. And more than 90% of respondents indicated moderate to strong interest towards investments in 3 additional areas: installing more renewable energy capacity, investing in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and nature-based solutions, or NBS. NBS are emerging in green recovery plans worldwide as strategies to enhance water security, climate resilience, climate adaptation, and disaster risk reduction.
As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we have published an executive summary that was sent to all Massachusetts municipalities, and we will be producing a peer-reviewed paper on this work this summer. We do want to especially thank Candace Pierce, the MMA Director of Communications and Membership, Patricia Vincasey, the Northeast Regional Director of the International City and County Management Association, ICMA, for those that are familiar, and Aidan McCaffrey, who lended invaluable expertise in the development of our graphics and figures. We also want to thank the Department of Economics, which supported 2 members of our team with Euro Fellowships for the fall and the spring semesters. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll now take questions.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers until our next presentation.
I have a question.
Please.
Is it possible to access individual municipal data from this survey?
We can discuss offline.
Okay. Thanks. Y'all are great. Great job. Really
Good question. Was there any distinction made in the data between the larger towns and the smaller towns? And think towns like Dalton and Nashville probably behave very differently than the municipalities in the Boston area, Cambridge and such.
I'll take this one if none of my other team members want to hop in. So we have made some distinctions in this early work, but we plan to do a lot more disaggregating, particularly by the different sectors, by urban, rural 1, rural 2, when we publish our full report. We're really interested to see some of those differences, particularly when you look at the green recovery strategies. The answers are very regional. So different regions have higher interest in different strategies. And there's been some interest from many of the municipalities and the nonprofits that we've partnered with to do this work in getting deeper analysis of sort of regional differences in interest for green recovery strategies. So that's definitely on the docket for our full analysis.
Thanks.
Ethan?
Yeah, I was really struck by one of the findings. It was around being able to look at data through a racial lens. And you had a very small number of communities that were looking at data through a racial lens. You had a significant number, I think 31%, who said that they would like to be able to look at it through a racial lens. Then you had this weird 48% that had no interest in looking at it in a racial lens. Am I over interpreting that? Am I reading that those municipalities were basically saying we're not interested in this lens? Do you have any insights into that number? That seems like such a strange finding. Are these communities that are so homogenous that they don't see a need for it, or do you feel like something about that question triggered a specific answer?
I'll take this one, guys. I think that is something that did come up in our discussions. I think it is something that we probably had the same interpretation that you did at first. And I think one of the things we really came up with is during this time, and especially in relation to this survey, that it's not the fact that they're not keen on getting those tools. It's just that it might not be a top priority right this second in relation to everything that's going on, but it certainly is something that we plan on looking into a little further. And one would think that might be a little more common of a wanted tool for most municipalities.
And it was interesting, I'll just jump in, that I think it was one of our mayors that we spoke to who asked us to add that question as a part of the question, because that town really wants to be able to disaggregate by race, but they don't have the ability right now. But then, yeah, I do think what you said about a lot of the hill towns, for example, are so homogenous that they might not be as interested as some of the larger cities.
Or they perceive themselves as being so homogenous. I say, as someone who lives in a very small far western Mass town. So
yeah.
Hi, I've got a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, apologies for this. I'm on an iPad and it's a little wonky. The question I had is whether you could just tell, not necessarily from the data, but just from your impressions about responses and so on, whether there was any variation in terms of the structure of local government. I don't know, I'm not an expert in local government in Massachusetts, so I don't know if it differs substantially in structure in terms of professionalization or who's in charge, the bureaucrats or the elected officials. But I was wondering, maybe even just from the way you were getting responses, whether you saw institutional arrangements affecting behavior in any way.
I can kind of add to this one. So we did run into a data set that had that data that we would be able to pull in the type of local government. We haven't looked into that yet, but that's a great note for something that we should look into in the future.
And one thing we asked municipalities about that's related to this question is whether they had sort of formal health departments, because there was a lot of variation in municipalities. Many have volunteer health departments. There's no full-time paid employee in health departments. So we asked that information, and I'm really interested to sort of break out some of these answers by what type of health department a town has, especially in terms of vaccine preparedness, and to sort of look at whether towns' health department structure plays a big role in their ability to provide vaccines and other health services.
I think we have time for at least one more question.
Do you guys see any kind of follow-up activity going on with the survey to find out if there's some institutional learning or some preparedness that resulted from this pandemic? Before and after photos, so to speak?
I think we'd love to do follow-up, but it sort of depends on what the MMA requests of us, especially because they were truly the ones that disseminated the survey. And they were really interested in getting this data. So I imagine that they'd be interested in getting more data in the future, but we'll just have to wait and see.
I'd love to see us work on some follow-up regarding the sort of equity outcomes of vaccine distribution. That was a really big concern for a lot of the municipalities. We especially when we focus grouped, that was a really big concern. And many municipalities in open-ended questions reported that they were concerned about this decision to sort of divert vaccines from municipal supply to mass vaccination and pharmacy site supply, that would have an equity impact. So I would be really interested to see some follow-up about how that shook out. But from this survey, we know that might be a little difficult because the tools to measure equity are not there in many municipalities.
Before we transition, I just wanted to make a note that I really would like to applaud this team because this group of students was able to put together, we put together a report in like 2 weeks as soon as we finished the data collection. So it was a major marathon. We blocked our schedules and we worked at full speed because the request was to get the data in real time for the municipalities. So congratulations again for all the hard work. And now we're going to transition to our second presentation. Let me pull it out and share it with you. 1 second, it's here. Okay. And our second presentation is on nature-based solutions. And it's a meta-analysis of literature on nature-based solutions. And I'm gonna leave space to our new second team.
Hello. Thank you. I hope you guys can all hear me. Thank you all for coming, even though you must be extremely busy around this time. As Dr. Vicarelli introduced, our research is a survey of quantitative literature on nature-based solutions. Our principal investigator is, of course, Dr. Vicarelli at the UMass School of Public Policy and Department of Economics. Our research team is comprised of 5 graduate students in the UMass School of Public Policy: Michael Kang, myself, Michael Marr. Say hello.
Sorry, I couldn't get my unmute. Sorry, I'm Michael Marr.
Yeah, and Miranda Vance.
Hello, I'm Miranda.
Yeah, Shannon McAndrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon.
And David Wasielewski.
I'm David.
And the brilliant undergraduate from Amherst College, Aryen Shrestha.
Hi, I'm Aryen Shrestha.
Yeah. All right, next slide, please. I'll begin with some basic definitions that we need to know for understanding this presentation better. Nature-based solutions are the International Union for Conservation of Nature defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal changes effectively and adaptively. And simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Below the figures are, the pictures are some of the more prominent examples of nature-based solutions. And EBM, or ecosystem-based adaptation, is a set of approaches implemented to adapt to climate change. These approaches involve the management of ecosystems and their services to reduce the vulnerability of human communities from the impact of climate change. EBM, ecosystem-based mitigation, is somewhat identical to EBA, but is more focused on carbon sequestration, and eco-based disaster reduction, or eco-DRR, is the sustainable management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystems to reduce disaster risks, aiming to achieve sustainable and resilient development. Next, please.
Okay, so now we'll be moving on to our research questions. This project is aimed at developing a global database of peer-reviewed studies on economic valuation of NBS and to perform a meta-analysis to assess existing scientific knowledge on the economic efficiency and equity of NBS. And throughout the presentation, there's going to be a special focus on ecosystem-based climate adaptation, ecosystem-based climate mitigation, and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction programs. Next slide. The motivation for the project is that ecosystem and ecosystem services are key to help achieve reduction in disaster risk, sustainable development, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. Their role is now also recognized by major international framework agreements, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the contribution for our project is that right now there's very limited knowledge about the overall economic performance of NBS, such as efficiency and equity. And our global meta-analysis is aiming to fill this literature gap. And the key information for practitioners to maximize effectiveness of project implementation. And this figure is just a snapshot of our database. I know you're not going to be able to see any of the specifics, but we worked in Excel for our database.
Yeah, there's a huge library of ecosystem research that recognizes the intrinsic biologic and ecological value of various environmental assets. The challenge from a policy perspective is to justify that investment in economics terms and look at these natural assets as preventive mechanisms in the face of climate change and natural hazards. Kind of gathering these diverse research efforts is intended to help policymakers consider investment in nature-based infrastructures as an alternative to man-made infrastructures. Our hope is to build a common language and in recognition of the economic and social value of nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the scope of the semester-long effort, we surveyed the library for recent peer-reviewed articles using keywords for types of ecosystems, economic evaluation methods, and natural disasters. We initially identified 164 articles that met the basic language requirements. Through more intense detailed review, we ended up with 48 articles that actually yielded the quantified economic evaluations we are focused on. These papers were further reviewed by several members of the team with data on the articles aggregated for this meta-analysis. The database was designed to capture important common elements within these diverse research efforts, and the following slides represent our preliminary findings.
Yeah, as David said, in this next portion of slides, we're going to be sharing some of the preliminary results from our meta-analysis so far. So the next slide is a key preliminary finding was like the regional distribution of the articles. The map here shows how many of the articles reviewed analyzed a location on a given continent. As we can see, the continent with the highest frequency was Europe, which was analyzed by 33% of the articles, while the least studied continents in terms of NBS was Antarctica and South America, which contributed to 0% and 2% of the articles respectively. Clearly, there's not a lot of equity in the regions researched, as Europe has a disproportionate amount of representation in these studies, while continents such as South America, Africa, and even Asia to some degree are underrepresented.
So in addition to looking at the locations of studies in our meta-analysis, we also wanted to track the ecosystem-based approaches that were analyzed in each of the articles. So over 87% of the articles in our database were about nature-based solutions. And 77% of the papers were about ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction projects, followed by EBA and then EBM. Next slide. So because nature-based solutions is still an emerging field, we also wanted to look at the language that authors were using to describe their studies. So for example, you could imagine a paper about the ways in which a mangrove forest can mitigate damage caused by floods and storms. And this is definitely a nature-based solution, but it might not actually be called an NBS in the article. So while 87% of papers were about nature-based solutions, only about 16% actually used that exact terminology. And you can see that this same trend applies to the other three approaches. So while 29% of studies were about ecosystem-based mitigation, only 4% actually used that term. And this really added a layer of complexity to the methodology that David was describing earlier, because we really wanted to make sure that we were capturing all economic valuations of nature-based solution and ecosystem-based adaptations. So we had to do a lot of work as a team to build a list of keywords and conduct really thorough searches to make sure that we were finding all of the relevant papers for our meta-analysis. Next slide. So the most common ecosystems that were analyzed in the articles we studied were wetlands, forest, and coastal ecosystems. But there were also a lot of papers on other ecosystems like urban ecosystems and coral reefs. And it was really exciting for us to learn about the potential for these ecosystems to mitigate damage from natural hazards. Next, please. Thank you. And the most common hazards analyzed were storms and floods. However, you can see that there are a host of natural hazards that healthy ecosystems can help to protect us from. These include landslides, heat waves, droughts, and forest fires.
Yeah, this pie graph presents the proportion of studies that measured the effect of nature-based solutions on biodiversity. So promoting biodiversity is one of the core goals of nature-based solutions, and most studies do acknowledge the importance, but surprisingly few quantitative studies measured or even addressed biodiversity in relation to nature-based solutions. This likely stems from the fact that any changes in biodiversity are inherently difficult to be quantified. Next slide, please. And of the studies that we reviewed, empirical analysis was largely the most common type of analysis, and nearly a half of empirical studies collected their own primary data. And yeah, the second most common is modeling and simulation. And there was more than expected number of meta-analysis, even though it was the fewest, and because it's only 4 percentage points difference. So next slide, please. This displays the frequency of economic valuation methodologies performed by the studies collected by our meta-analysis. Direct cost analysis is the most frequently employed method, as it is arguably somewhat easier, relatively. One important point is that there is a large disparity between the number of cost-benefit analysis, we also call it CBA, and equity analysis. Although cost-benefit analysis should ideally be accompanied by equity analysis, considering that cost-benefit analysis measures average treatment effect, which disregards distributional effect of policy, or in this case, nature-based solutions. So this may indicate a potential disproportionate distribution of benefits from nature-based solutions. Next slide, please.
Excellent. So moving on from the economic valuation methodologies, we're also really interested in the different types of ecosystem services that the ecosystems that Mo was talking about earlier took a look at. So as you can see here, we had 4 primary categories of ecosystem services. You have protective, regulating, provisioning, and cultural. So these are a few of the examples of each one. So let's say flood and landslide protections are examples of different protective services that different ecosystems can offer. As far as regulation, carbon capture and sequestration was a huge one that we saw quite often, as well as the water quality improvement. Provisioning has to do with what can be provided by that ecosystem. So food, potable water provision, and then cultural services often came down to what are the values provided by the recreation opportunities of that ecosystem, of that region. So yeah, it's quite interesting. These are just a few of the common types. There are plenty others. There's a huge diversity for each of these 4 general categories. Next slide, please. But what was interesting is that the majority of our studies ended up looking primarily at protective services. And you see up here, 79% of studies we looked at were focused on protective services, and under that, slightly around half, 54%, looking at regulating services as well. Provisioning and cultural services rounded out, 37 and 33%. There's a number of reasons why this possibly could be. Those services could be arguably harder to value, as Michael was alluding to before as well. So an interesting rounding out of how they were measured and how often they were measured. Next slide, please. Excellent. And this is one of the last pieces that we are really interested by were the limitations. As was mentioned earlier, this is an emerging field. So we're really starting to see more of these studies starting to come out and getting an idea of what are the limitations and unknowns identified by both the authors and by people reading those as an important piece. You can see the biggest limitation that was identified both by the original authors and us as reviewers were the uncertainty about the different estimates, as well as a couple different pieces of having strong assumptions and a lack of data, which is understandable in an emerging field. So this was a difficult piece as well, but finding these weaknesses was an important piece of understanding the overall picture. Next slide, please. As far as next steps goes, these are, as Aryen mentioned, these are preliminary findings. What we need to do next is complete a few different pieces, including a second cross review of all the literature to ensure that there is no bias in our analyses. And then we're going to take that and do a final analysis and write it up and submit. And once we've done that, it's going to be a really good piece to add to the overall literature in terms of the techniques for economic valuation, finding which of those have different advantages and disadvantages, as well, and as Michael Kang was talking to before, finding economic efficiency and equity and the balance in there. So that's what we're up to next. And last slide, please. And of course, we have to acknowledge PEDR, which is the Partnership of Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction. They've been kind of the inspiration for this. We all worked in a winter course before. They provide the curriculum for that and have provided assistance and advisement through the entire course of this project, and will continue to as we go. So that about wraps up our presentation, and we appreciate your time and thank you for paying attention. And if you have any questions, we'd love to take them.
Congratulations again for another excellent presentation. If there are questions, Ale.
Yeah, I've got a question. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You noted that the research you're looking at is coming mainly out of the developed world. And this is sort of typical of, research on governance questions and policy questions generally. And I'm wondering, just as you were going through this material, do you have, as you're drawing conclusions from the results you're seeing, are there any assumptions in there that we need to flag about, I don't know what it would be, governance preconditions, institutional preconditions? Is there any extent to which we're basically telling a story about NBRs in the developed world that might not carry over to the global south, for example?
So one thing that I think we all kind of noticed is differences in methodologies used. And so it's often true that methodologies that are more resource intensive, like for example, conducting a contingent valuation, are happening in higher wealth countries, where lower wealth countries are using more quick and affordable methodologies, like doing a value transfer approach. So just kind of piggybacking off of other folks' research and the numbers that they ultimately came up with. So I do think that it's possible that the measurements for the value of these ecosystems are probably more accurate when they're coming from higher wealth countries, because they have more resources to dedicate to the actual economic valuation itself.
Did you get an impression about whether there's sort of differences in the kinds of projects that are being studied in the north and the south?
So breaking it down by location in this way is not something that we have done yet. However, it's very high on our to-do list. And I know there's a whole host of disaggregating that we're really excited to do. So
great, thank you.
I'll go next if anyone else.
Please.
Yeah, thanks, Marta. Congratulations. That was a lot of research that you conducted for this. I'm very impressed. Meta-analysis is hard, I think, because people are coming at it with their particular questions and methods, and synthesizing that is really tough. So that is a really big piece of lifting that you did. So my question is about process for you all. There's this concept called intercoder reliability, which is basically kind of how do you establish that two different researchers, or a team in this case, are analyzing something in the same way. Can you speak to how you approached that challenge in this project?
I can take that question. So you're 100% right. Reducing bias in that regard is really important. We're actually probably about a third to a halfway done with that piece. We're doing second reviews and third reviews of those articles in order to ensure that, so that bias is not there. The way we're doing it is essentially starting a clean line without knowledge of the previous reviewers' thoughts on an article, going through it, and then once those are two complete, comparing those two and looking at the pieces that don't essentially line up, figuring out, okay, what is the issue here? Where has someone had a misstep? And then there's been a few times where we've all come together as an entire research group and pondered individual questions at length to try and come to a conclusion about what is the deal here, especially because, as you said from the beginning, authors and researchers are coming at things with their own ideas. So figuring out what exactly is the deal is, as a team was how we addressed that.
Thank you. And I have one other quick question about, it looked like improving habitat was not mentioned as one of the services. Was that right? I think Marr, that was in your slides where you were talking about the different categories of services provided. Did I just miss that, or was that just not listed as a significant service?
So most of in the eco DRR and EBA world, we're looking at anthropomorphic sense of it. So whatever's affecting human beings. As the question about biodiversity is probably the closest that we would have to answering that question. So unfortunately, habitat is not necessarily one of the primary questions in here.
Sorry, I have a question, Juniper. Do you mean habitat for human beings or habitat for species that are not human beings?
Mostly, I was just thinking that might be an unintentional or possibly intentional outcome of using these nature-based systems. So even if the point was, let's say, to prevent flooding to a community, they might still have found that it improved water quality, which then had a result on habitat for animals. Yeah.
So then I can provide the answer. So the improvement of habitat basically is transversal to the 4 types of ecosystem services that we mentioned in those boxes. The protective, regulatory, provisioning, and then cultural usually are mutually exclusive and comprehensive. So then the improvement of habitat would be achieved when the boxes are checked in relation to those.
Thanks, Marta.
Al, do you still have a question by any chance?
No, I asked mine, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Maybe I have a question for you. Is there any aspect of your research that you found particularly surprising, or that was a moment of, oh, wow, that you didn't expect? Let me face this question by saying that all the students involved in this project attended the 2020-2021 United Nations Sustainable Solutions Winter School that was co-hosted by UMass, McMaster University, and the United Nations University. So they have actually worked very hard to be able to complete this project, because they actually had to take a class in an international setting in order to be exposed to these issues. And the class was pleasant, I'm sure, but also demanding because it was during the winter break. The positive of the class was also strong exposure to international scholars and practitioners who are leaders of this discipline of nature-based solutions, and in particular ecosystem-based climate adaptation and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. So I think that there was so much learning for you, and I was just wondering what were aspects that were interesting or new to you that you would like to share with us.
I'll take a shot at it. I think that the fact that this is so diverse and kind of seeps into just about every aspect of socioeconomics is pretty surprising. I have viewed, environment stuff, save the trees, don't cut down the trees, or, very focused on environmental stuff. But there's racial equity, there's all kinds of aspects that you would not expect to be involved in this socioeconomic terms. It's a lot bigger than what I thought it was.
Yeah, one more thing, it's not that relevant, but I was surprised at some of the papers or some of the published papers that are supposed to be very convincing or compelling. I did not see, like when I didn't see much evidence, they would just conclude that, oh, we found this and so on. So we conclude this. So when we review papers, we really need to look into it. Sometimes when I'm busy, I just read the introduction and conclusion. Sometimes I'm sorry, but I realized that I shouldn't do that anymore.
Any more thoughts?
Just kind of on a similar note to what Michael was saying, I came into this project fresh out of an environmental economics course. And so I feel like I had a clear picture in my head of what an ideal economic valuation would look like. And as we started really diving into these papers, I was noticing that policy decisions are being made after valuing maybe one or two of this whole host of services that, Michael Marr was explaining to us. And so this value that we're assigning to ecosystem services, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And we're really, barely scratching the surface of all of the things that ecosystems do for us and of the importance of protecting them, basically. So it was really interesting to see how we're making our decisions.
Okay, if there are no more contributions, we can transition to the last presentation. Thank you again for your great job. Our last presentation, Derek, I think you have control of the share button, so you can go ahead and share.
Yes, I'm going to do that now. Then you all can tell me if things are happening correctly. Can you all hear me as well?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Slideshow. Okay, can you all just see the
perfect
the slideshow? That's great, perfect. Well, awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm here. My name is Derek Dunlea. I'm here with my colleague Taylor Lewis. Taylor, you can wave and say hi.
Hey everyone, I'm Taylor.
And of course, Professor Marta Vicarelli was our primary investigator with us for this project. So we're working with a group called Alturi and along with Lee Badgett. So we're looking at a placeholder application called LGBTQrowd and specifically doing research on if a crowdfunding application could be sustainable and needed in the future. But to give you some background on the project, Alturi is an online hub for news, stories, and advocacy. They provide updates and information on issues facing the LGBTI community around the globe. They provide profiles, narratives of local and international organizations working to improve lives of LGBTI people. But it's not from a grand staircase type of view. This is organizers on the ground, which is what kind of makes the project unique. And then of course, Lee Badgett, who I saw join the room recently. So hi, Lee, thanks for joining us today. Professor Lee Badgett from the UMass Amherst LGBTI Livelihoods Project. It's a set of initiatives designed to identify and study existing projects focused on creating economic opportunities for LGBTI people globally, and to design new programs for expanding economic opportunities. So that, along with some of the other project background studies that we did, specifically a report provided to us by Charlie Rounds and Alturi called the LGBT Giving Project, which we'll mention a few times throughout this presentation, really gave us the basis for the research that we conducted. Presented here are the two main research questions that we used. Which current crowdsourcing platforms would make good models to use for designing LGBTQrowd? And once again, LGBTQrowd is the placeholder name for a hypothetical application, a crowdfunding application that could be the result of future projects. And then the second question, what are the important design elements or problems that must be solved in creating LGBTQrowd? And how do our key comparators address those issues? And involved in these questions as well as the establishment of a list of 8 to 10 key comparators or platforms that Taylor will touch on in a second as well.
Thank you, Derek. So this is overview of our methodology for this project. So first, we did some research on literature around generational giving. So the giving habits of different generations, like millennials, Gen Z versus older generations. And then also some like website design for younger generations as well. We also created a list of key comparators and identified important features. And then we did some interviews with organizers, really gaining more understanding and knowledge about their expertise in the field, as well as how their organizations operate. And lastly, we created and sent out a post-interview Qualtrics survey to ask more specific questions about features related to LGBTQrowd. And now I'm going to give an overview of some of these key comparators that we used. When researching key comparators, we found that these platforms could be broken up into 6 categories: 1, crowdfunding; 2, donation and volunteer; 3, venture capital; 4, crowdsourcing; and 5, peer-to-peer lending; lastly 6, mobile payments. These are all platforms we can learn from in the development of LGBTQrowd. So when we think about crowdfunding, we often think about platforms like GoFundMe, really a trailblazer in crowdfunding. But there are also other platforms that we can learn from as well. So we're going to the next category of donation and volunteer. This category is platforms that engage in volunteer management. Examples of this is Kindly, a new platform and app that connects volunteers to social causes and nonprofit organizations in their communities. This is a new platform, like I said, so it's mainly based in the Twin Cities. And then the next category for venture capital, this category, firms provide private equity and capital for startups, expecting a significant return on investment. Gangles is a example of this. They're an investment firm that represents LGBT plus community and allies, investing in venture capitalist backed companies. In addition to providing capital, they also provide business acumen and a business network as well for startups. Next category, crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing differs from crowdfunding here because it's referring to enlisting services, skills, or ideas rather than financial resources. So Kirky is an example for this. They pair investors with product designers and big manufacturers, and really allowing anybody to submit an idea and create it and then sell it to a market, and the venture receives a cut from the profits. The next one category is peer-to-peer lending, which is similar to crowdfunding category, but in this category, funding is raised for loans in which the recipient is expected to pay back. Kiva's platform is very similar to GoFundMe in its ability to tell stories and connect with people based on these stories. And lastly, we included mobile payment platforms like Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal, which also owns Venmo. Because we noticed that there's informal crowdfunding that is done through these platforms. Is it easier and simpler way to donate and receive quick access to funds? Also, these platforms have essentially become their own banks, and companies are recognizing that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides of why that's important. Next, important feature that we want to highlight is storytelling, and we're going to use Kiva to really highlight this. Kiva was our starting comparator. It was recommended to us by Professor Lee Badgett in our initial meetings. We took some screenshots here of the app to showcase some of its features. A feature, like I said, I want to highlight is really storytelling. Storytelling is essential in crowdfunding. Storytelling can create a sense of community between the storyteller and listener, inspires people to give, and especially if they feel as if they're a part of this story. So some of these images they're circled to highlight some of the ways that Kiva does this. So one in the first image to the left, the title really draws people in. It already tells people this is an impact of your funding. Kiva is really smart in that they already have like their donation feature right after that bolded, because that alone can lead to donations. And then further down, you see that this organization further tell a story and draw people in. And to this middle image, you see that the search feature even incorporates this aspect of storytelling by allowing people to sort themselves into these organizers' stories. And then you can see in the below the middle image and towards the right, you can see how Kiva highlights funders' impact and allows them to see like how they're a part of the story, how their money and how their funding will really change people's lives in organizations. For key comparators, you also included UNICEF and PETA, two organizations that are also really great storytellers. UNICEF has a well-designed and managed YouTube channel. They're able to further connect with people by allowing them to see and hear people's stories. The ability to manage and navigate social media is important because it allows people and organizations to spread their brand and their message to a large audience. Well, UNICEF and PETA does this really well. PETA, for example, UNICEF, for example, make sure that with their posts, it encompasses a photo or video as well. So it's not just like text they're using images, they're using videos to really grab people in. PETA has joined the TikTok phenomenon, a short form video sharing platform with a tagline of trends start here. TikTok is designed for virality, not just on the app, but also across all major social media platforms. And PETA has been able to really take that on and have some videos also go viral on that app, as well as other social media platforms. Venmo might be for mobile payments, but it's also social media in a way that you can keep tags on the financial purchases of your network. I use the term social giving here because I think that's what I believe that LGBTQ crowd can really do and create as well. Lastly, I want to focus on integration. Kiva integrates PayPal and Apple Pay. And Apple Pay right here is really smart because if you have a Venmo card or Cash App card, you can technically connect your account through that way as well. And then Kiva also allows you to sign in with like Google, Facebook, and other social media platforms to make sign in and sign up like really easy.
So great, Taylor, thank you so much for that. And so we'll go from here. So outside of just looking externally at the world and being able to just Google different platforms and look through different research products, we also had an effort to do some virtual surveys with real organizers on the ground to kind of match that vision and what Alteri has. So from our interviews, we'll give you the methodology. And in these interviews, we gave a small elevator pitch of around 2 minutes or so on what our project was. These were not long interviews. These would usually be about 30 to 40 minutes. And we interviewed 6 individuals who are all on the ground in their own ways, either starting organizations or participating at high levels in them. And we interviewed individuals from 3 continents, 2 individuals from Kenya, 1 from Argentina, 1 from the Caribbean, and 2 from the US. So we were able to really definitely get a lens that was outside of that Western view, which is really important. We learned that some organizations have completely different operational models and funding structures, from traditional nonprofits to social enterprises that operate as a business, but with a social purpose. And these are all organizations that serve LGBT people in very different ways, but still leads to the same economic empowerment mission. And these organizations have, and we followed up on these interviews with an online survey run through Qualtrics, which I'll talk about momentarily. Some of the key findings that we picked up from this was, and right off the bat, and how you can see titled in this presentation, is that this type of platform like LGBTQrowd is really needed. I don't think it's really a question of if it's just something that should be integrated into another application at this point, but all the interviewees indicated a need for a crowdfunding platform that specifically focuses on LGBTI people. Crowdfunding is one of the folks we interviewed really drove home the problems with the traditional fundraising model. And in one way, crowdfunding is seen as an essential innovation within the LGBTI sphere because of the democratization it provides to fundraising. Essentially, as the old world of fundraising dollars are controlled primarily by people in the global north, the priorities of the organizers on the ground are not always the center point. And so crowdfunding really offers an opportunity for the organizer to be the center point. Additionally, there's currently a low yield of fundraising within the LGBTI community. And for itself shown by the LGBT Given report, that there's a big possibility there to get more funding from the base. These are some of our online survey results, and our online survey we'll talk about is going to take 2 different forms. The current survey was just a survey that we sent out to individuals that we had interviewed. And what these really showed us is the focus should be raising on money for general organization funds and targeted campaigns for those organizations, with amounts ranging from $10,000 to $50,000. Publicity, donations, and connections are most important to the end results that organizers want. And there was a lot of other features that could be recommended in applications in terms of, it could be a micro-lending app instead. It could be about donor investments and social funds. But we really see, especially from these interviews and from the results, that it should just be a targeted crowdfunding platform. Organizers want the application to be a website and a phone application. They want it to stay simple. And they always want to prioritize a low administrative overhead cost. And finally, LGBT organizations know what they're doing. What they're looking for is funding and connections. It's not that people in the global north, people in the west have the solutions and can just give it to these groups. These groups have the solutions, they don't have the resources. But yes. And recommendations and conclusions, Taylor.
Thank you, Derek. So these are some of the recognitions, inclusions that we have for L2. So one, we recommend that there's target audience, that you design a platform that encourages young donors, but also LGBTQrowd staff would build partnerships with higher income donors. One of the things of talking to Charlie Rounds is just really excitement of trying to engage younger generations and also the LGBTQ community. And so I think some of the features that we highlighted early in this presentation can really attract these younger donors. And then, as far as the Generation Z and millennials, they're already socially conscious, and hopefully they will become the future and the future like high income donors that you want to target as well. We definitely want to still tap into the higher income funding as well. And as nonprofits have already know, they have development teams strategies because building and maintaining connections with higher income donors takes a lot of strategy and resources. They think L3 can really build in building that human resources around the apps to do. As far as types of organizations, I think it's really important to cater to nonprofit organizations and social for-profit enterprises, really because they have great stories that really draw people in and allow people to feel like they're having a social impact. And so I think that is really important to cater to organizations like that. But also talking to a few interviewees, we noticed that some LGBTQI organizations across the globe will start social for-profit enterprises to really build funding and to really empower themselves away from global north funding as well that Derek was talking about before. So it's really important to really target those organizations that are doing that work. Next, really integrate social media and digital payment integrations. Again, a feature to really attract the younger generations to make sign up, login, donations really simple, really easy, especially if you're trying to, when I talk about later, utilize social media to spread the message about things. The next one is establish sponsorships. One of the people that we interviewed, his name is John Waters, and he talked about how for getting into LGBTQ tourism, he sold tickets for a cruise, and a percentage of those tickets were then used to be given to LGBT global organizations as well. And so I think it'd be really interesting for LGBTQrowd to fund themselves or potentially other organizations to sell experiences or products and work with different corporations to be able to do that as well. For some other recommendations, it's really important to incorporate community building and mentorships. A lot of respondents to the survey and people we interviewed have mentioned wanted this community. And then community building, it allows LGBT organizations to feel empowered, especially globally, when you're interacting in anti-LGBT countries. You feel empowered by creating a sense of belonging and not feeling alone that you're doing that work in these kind of countries. But it also can be a way for capacity building. Organizations can come together and share their strengths and draw inspiration from others. And as I talked about before, really establishing the social media's presence. That's how you're going to spread message to a large audience of all generations. I think a lot of different generations, younger and older, are on social media. And so I think it's really important to utilize this way of spreading information really fast and reaching a large audience as well. And to really do that, social media is a skill and an art. And so really having a social media manager on staff to be able to do that, but also do like the data analysis and analytics behind social media. Next would be to incorporate privacy features. As I talked about before, we're gonna be working with a lot of LGBTI organizations that are global and are in countries that are anti-LGBTI and have a lot of anti-LGBTI policies and laws. And so really privacy is going to be really huge for a lot of these organizations. And I think it's really important to include some secure and safe fund distribution within the platform to make sure that we are not putting folks into jeopardy and potentially outing folks. I think what we can really do here is to focus on a lot of the social for-profit enterprises that these organizations are doing, so that we are more focusing on that and funding those projects rather than talking about the organization's missions and what they're doing in the countries. And then lastly, make sure that we have a phased launch for two reasons. One, it's difficult to incorporate all features at once, but also two, it allows feedback from the community as well as the potential market that you're targeting.
Yeah, that's great, Taylor. Thank you. And so we have some next steps, which is really to take this Qualtrics survey that we developed for the internal group and instead expand it to global LGBTI organizations and leaders to collect more feedback, to really get an idea of how big that range is in terms of feedback and what people would really be looking for as features in an application. And to develop a strategy to create some sort of technical and digital partnership for any sort of LGBTQrowd alpha development and launch. It's definitely not something that a few public policy students would probably be able to do, at least not with the skill set that Taylor and I had to develop an application. So this is obviously a wide-ranging, thought process and a continuing research project. But that would definitely be one of the next steps in terms of seeing what the cost would be at that technical aspect level. And then that really ends our presentation. So we would love to take questions from you all. And we just want to send another special thank you, Lee. We know you're in the audience, and Marta, of course, you're here with us right now. We really appreciate the work that you two have put into this project. And then, of course, Charlie Rounds and Jacob Huang. And Charlie and Jacob were instrumental for us to understand some of the aspects of the industry that we're looking at, and their experiences are going to make this app go forward in the future. So thank you all.
Congratulations for another great presentation. We have questions. Ethan?
So terrific piece of research. I really love the overview of what options are out there. I think it's terrific that you've sort of isolated this need for a dedicated LGBTQ fundraising platform. One challenge with crowdfunding platforms, and in fact, money transfer platforms of any type, is that because they can be used for things like laundering money, generally they face very, very heavy regulatory scrutiny, including know your customer laws. And it can be really challenging to build a new product in the space. I was a little surprised to hear you talking about building a new product rather than sort of building on top of an existing service. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about things like know your customer and these other sort of regulatory issues around this?
Definitely, and we had a conversation with Kent Kildara, who runs a fund called the Rustin Fund, and he really opened our eyes to this during our research because we saw how tough of a regulatory environment it was in terms of being able to transfer certain types of funds over and whatnot. And I think what was shown was the simplicity of some of the smaller organizations that are raising funds for LGBTI organizations throughout the world are really effective because they're able to just use internal networks to raise funds, and they're able to incorporate it in the fact that you have 4 people in the industry who are running a nonprofit as a board, and as a result they have 501c3 status and whatnot, and they're able to just make transfers over to different groups and whatnot. And so because of the scale, they're able to use those type of options. But this isn't the scale that is necessary in this field for it to go forward. And I think that's what we see with Kiva, and it's something that we have in our recommendations as well, in what we're writing for our final paper, is that looking at an app like Kiva, you can do both things. You can go to Kiva and say, hey, right now you don't have LGBTI as a search tool for a type of person to donate to in the developing world, or to give microloans into in the developing world. What if we leveraged your platform to do that in the time being? And that wouldn't conflict with creating an independent LGBTI focused application. So part of it is it's going to be left up to future research, and that's definitely a consideration for future research teams. But at the same time, the need was so present. I don't think Taylor and I would have been able to like go forward necessarily with the research and say, oh, no, that would be too difficult. Because saying it's too difficult this early in the process, I think would be counterproductive to the social change we're trying to make.
I commend you for doing it. I particularly commend you for looking at this in the international context. The international context complicates your problems, you know, tenfold. And I do think it's totally worth pursuing. I think it's one of those cases where being careful of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good may be part of this. Because if you could get something like Kiva to have a dedicated LGBTQI, you know, piece of things, that would be a tremendous step forward.
Thank you, Ethan.
Any more questions? While we are waiting for a question, I just wanted to clarify something. I'm not principal investigator in the study. I can only be an advisor in the study. It's okay. But thank you for giving me this honor for a few minutes.
Leue raises her hand.
Yeah. Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say I am here. I'm going to turn my video off because it's not working very well right now. Anyway, thank you all so much for doing this. This is really amazing. You did so many different things that I hadn't even thought of. So that's really fantastic. I guess I have kind of a follow-up question to the point that Ethan was raising, which is, it seems like there may be a tension between certain kinds of things that a platform might want to do versus the kinds of things that the organizations might want. Like organizations might want to just say, I'm going to sign up and then people will send me money, you know, whereas the platform may either for regulatory reasons or for other reasons want to do some sort of vetting. So is that something that you found any information on in terms, or have any thoughts on in terms of that vetting question before putting a project on the platform? What should the administrative side of the platform be doing?
Yeah, following up what Derek said, really using the Rustin Fund as an example. I think the Rustin Fund is doing really great work and already raising funds and sending funds to LGBTI organizations across the globe, but they're very small scale for that reason of like trying to get away with administrative fees. And so I think that we can really learn from them and try to scale up for them. And one of the things that can't really talk about with the Rustin Fund is already this like vetting kind of process, because the network is like just there. What people know about these organizations across the globe are kind of vetting for each other. So I think that one of the great things for a platform like this is that you have Altrui and have these connections to these different people globally who can kind of do that vetting process like for you as well. And I think that that's kind of a part of like the kind of feedback or recommendations that we will be providing is like really developing a team and a staff to support this. And a part of that is having somebody who's going to do that vetting and working with these different organizations and to really confirm that they are doing what they're supposed to do.
And just to follow up on that as well, I think it's important to note that the phased launch. Taylor and I were talking about another organization that specifically operates right now, like the Twin Cities. But if you go to the application, it's like, oh, wow, this is going to be great. Like I can just like donate time to volunteerism in my area right now. And then when you go in, you're kind of disappointed to learn everything's either a virtual option or it's like only located in the Twin Cities because that's where they're based out of. But what you can see is that there's potential there and that you can start it at that lower point and still be able to add on to the application as it went. I mean, it's the same way that when we're looking at the growth of Venmo as well and kind of like what they kept adding to their system. These weren't applications that had all the features at one time. But if you create some sort of agreed upon central organization structure, it's something that you can grow over time as you see the need exists.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Leue.
Any more questions? Taylor and Derek, do you have anything more that you would like to share about this?
I just want to say it was a really great project to get to work on. We got to meet some like really just impressive activists who are doing the work every day throughout the world. And I think before this year, I would never have thought of using video conferencing in a way that would be productive to me personally. And I think we all saw that transition. And so it provided a really great opportunity to say, oh, we want to talk to somebody here. Yeah, well, let's just call them up. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Like 2 emails later, 2 weeks later, we had interviews with people around the world. So there's a lot of bad that's come from the past year, but a lot of good at the same time. And I hope that it can move this project forward in the future.
Yeah, in fact, so building on that, I have to say that it was a real pleasure to work with all of you, even though I have never met in person many of you. and it's also, it gave us also the possibility to collaborate with the people abroad. For example, for the second team, there is a team member who is a student, a doctoral student at the university, the United Nations University in Bonn, Germany, and is helping us with the mapping of the results. So it's beautiful to see this international community coming together. I really congratulate all of you for the fantastic work that you have been doing this semester, and many of you are continuing this work towards final deliverables. I don't know if Al has any closing remarks that he would like to share.
Yes, I'm not going to go in video. I'm struggling to master Zoom on an iPad, so excuse me, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of the students for the great work you did today. These were 3 fascinating presentations, and especially thank you for your persistence in grappling with really important policy problems at a really challenging time. We've had a year that's really presented distinctive challenges, and everyone has risen to the occasion. We're coming out the other side right now, and I look forward, and I'm sure all the other faculty do, look forward to the time when we can get together in person and talk about policy problems and get to know one another. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you also for those who are here with us, listening to our presentations. And bye-bye to everybody.